welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm Gloria Polites of LTC, your host for today's show. And with me in the studio is author David Osborne. Welcome, and thanks for coming.
Oh, thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. I'm going to give you a little bit of his background, a little longer than I usually do for our guests. He is the author of 5 nonfiction books: Laboratories of Democracy, Reinventing Government, which was a New York Times bestseller, Banishing Bureaucracy, The Reinventor's Field Book, and The Price of Government. He's also written articles for The Washington Post, The Atlantic, New York Times Magazine, and lots of others. He has worked as an advisor to Vice President Al Gore, and he has advised presidents and governors and ministers and mayors and school superintendents and foreign governments. So he has quite a background there. And currently, he is a senior fellow at the Progressive Policy Institute, and he's directing a program, or a project, I should say, about reinventing America's schools, creating a 21st century education system. And the book he's writing about that should be released in September. None of which is what we're going to talk about today. But which makes it all more amazing, at least to me, that he carved out the time, doing all of these things, to write his first novel, The Coming. Okay? It's a 500-page historical novel that is fascinating and extremely well researched. And I've read it, so I'm not just using other people's reviews. I really, I can really recommend it, basically. It is about Native and white American relations, covering 7 decades. Okay, and it starts with the Lewis and Clark expedition meeting for the first time the Nez Perce, or the Nimipu Indians.
Right.
And it goes on from there. So my first question is, why and what compelled you to write this with all the other things you have on your plate?
Yeah, what in the world was I thinking? Oh, it's a long story. I'll try to do a brief version of it. When I was about 17, I decided I wanted to be a writer, and I novels, if you ask people what are the most important books they've ever read, they'll usually mention fiction, which is kind of odd because, fiction is made up. But fiction reaches you at an emotional level. It draws you in, and you have an experience, an emotional experience. And so it reaches you at a level that most nonfiction doesn't, which is why it's so powerful. So I'd always wanted to do that. That's a really powerful trick. In my 20s, I tried and failed because I didn't know what I was doing. And then I went on doing journalism and then writing the nonfiction books. And after my 3rd nonfiction book, just after I finished it, in the summer of 1996, I was completely burned out. I'd written these 3 books in about a dozen years and been working way too hard for far too long. I had 4 young kids. My wife was a busy doctor. Life was just too full, and I was just burned out. And I just was filled with longing to do something entirely different, and was watching a documentary, a Ken Burns documentary called The West. And I learned in the one episode that William Clark had left behind a pregnant woman among the Nez Perce, and he had a Nez Perce son. And in the next episode, I learned that that son was alive in the war 72 years later, in 1877, that really crushed the part of the Nez Perce tribe that refused to go on the reservation. And I knew that story because when I was 19, I had been on a trip where we did what's called the Nez Perce Trail, which is the battle sites from that war. And I kind of sat up mentally, bolt upright, and thought, my God, that's the bookends of an incredible story. And it just grabbed me. So I started reading, and I did some research. I took a trip out west, went to a writers' conference whose theme was the return of the Nez Perce in the Wallowa Valley, where Joseph and his band lived. Kind of kicked the tires on the idea, talked to some Nez Perce people, and decided it was completely impractical. And put it away. Said, this, maybe when I retire. But I would have to spend a lot of time out there to understand the Nez Perce, and how could I do that? Then, 4 years later, my wife was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And, you go into shock. And after about a month of that, when you come out of it, one of the things you realize is if there's something you've always wanted to do, you'd better get started because you don't know how long you have. And I had always wanted to write a novel, and I had this idea that just wouldn't let go. And so I decided to give it a try. Long time ago.
How long did you spend writing this book?
I started in 2001, and I sent it to the publisher in 2014. And there were a few years around when my wife went downhill and died when I did not work on it. So I spent a little over a decade. And I didn't work on it full time. I was still, making a living and doing consulting and speaking and writing another book. And I worked on it maybe half time, half the year on average. So maybe quarter time, and a lot of weekends, and whenever I could.
And got it done.
And yeah, I did a lot of drafts. It was a real learning experience. I mean, as a nonfiction writer, first I had to unlearn a lot of things. In nonfiction, you want to make everything clear to the reader. You don't want anyone confused, puzzled, right? Well, in fiction, that's boring. In fiction, you kind of want to keep the reader guessing and wondering and turning the page to why did he say that? What does that mean? You want the reader to engage. And so anyway, I had a lot to learn, and I did a lot of drafts, and I had a couple of novelists who were mentors and helped me, and there was a lot of trial and error. And finally, it began, after many years, it began to round into shape.
Wonderful. I guess if we have any aspiring writers out there, they'll know it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And not to get discouraged, right? Keep going.
Yeah. You need talent, but you need persistence. Persistence is probably more important.
Right.
Right.
Now, I was really impressed with all the detail, obviously, in 500 pages. And, all the details of the expedition, just getting to that point where they met the Nez Perce, and by the way, historical novels are my favorite too. I think I've learned so much more about history coming to life.
Yeah, I love them too, which is one reason I wrote one.
So, but that's sort of a short part of the book.
Yeah.
And then you had to go on, and how much did you find that could fill that part? How much information was there?
About the Nez Perce?
About the Nez Perce, about the characters you wrote.
So my main character is named Daytime Smoke, and he is the son of William Clark. He's a tall, white-skinned or pale-skinned, red-headed Indian, and he really lived. He would be introduced to generals and journalists. Hey, this is William Clark's son. So we know he lived. The problem was I couldn't find anything about the course of his life. None of the Nez Perce seemed to know anything about the course of his life. So basically the novel is quite close to history, except I made up his life, and I was able to put him at key historical points and involve him in that, so that it's also a story of his people and what happened to them over that period of time. They were Americans' best friends in the Northwest. They loved Lewis and Clark. They really bonded. And then fur trappers started showing up, and they bonded with them. They traveled with them, showed them where to trap beaver, partied with them, married them. Then they sent 4 men in 1831 to St. Louis to ask William Clark, who was superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Louisiana Territory, for missionaries and Bibles. And missionaries started to arrive, and they embraced them. Actually had a bad experience. They drew the short straw. They got a really warped missionary. Fortunately, had a wife who was a saint, who the Nez Perce loved. But anyway, there was that period, and then conflict. When settlers began to arrive in the Northwest, conflict began to erupt. Gold was discovered. Miners invaded Indian lands. That led to conflict. And all through that period, the Nez Perce were our friends. And when conflict would erupt, they would either stay out of it or help the U.S. rather than helping their friends in other tribes. So they were Americans' favorite tribe out there. And then gold was discovered on their land in 1860. And you can imagine what happened.
Right. And I knew in some way that the Nez Perce were favored by the Americans and that they had helped them, but I had no idea until I read this of all the details that led into that. So thank you for enlightening me on that.
And Americans loved them.
Yeah.
They had different attitudes about different tribes. The Sioux were very aggressive and warlike. They didn't like the Sioux. And by they, I mean first the fur trappers and then the settlers. And the Blackfeet were incredibly aggressive. Nobody liked them. But the Nez Perce, Americans loved. They're wonderful people. They still are. And they were very honest and decent and just, they were sort of Americans' favorite tribe in that region.
Right, and they were so welcoming to the Lewis and Clark expedition because they were in pretty rough shape by the time they got to the Nez Perce.
Yeah, and there's a funny story, which is in the book. Lewis and Clark basically were starving to death in the Rockies, in the Bitterroot Range. It took them twice as long as they expected to get across. They started eating their horses. And when they did contact the Nez Perce, they were very weak. The Nez Perce fed them. They all, because they'd been starving, after eating a big meal, they all got sick. And the Nez Perce were sitting around sort of saying, they have a lot of guns and ammunition. And we need it because the Blackfeet are getting guns and ammunition from the British in Canada. And when we go hunt buffalo on the plains, the Blackfeet attack us. So we need this stuff. Let's kill them all. And they were about to when, as you know from reading it, an elderly Nez Perce woman stepped into the teepee and said, "Don't hurt these people. Do them no harm. These are the kind of people who helped me. These are good people." Because when she was young, she'd been kidnapped by another tribe. She'd been taken far to the east. She'd been sold to another tribe. Then she'd been sold to an Englishman in Canada, married to him, had a child, then got wind that he was going to take her to England and walked home, probably 1,500 miles. Her child died on the trip. She almost died, and she was found by the side of a trail by another tribe, and they nursed her back, to health and helped her go home. So this is years and years later. She remembered white people and she was probably one of the very few who had ever seen a white person. Mm-hmm. She remembered them as good people, and that saved Lewis and Clark.
It started the whole...
It's amazing how history works, the element of chance.
It is,
yeah.
The element of chance. But another thing that I think is interesting and that whites may be more skeptical about, or at least most whites are pretty skeptical about, was the prophecies and the visions that they had. And I guess there were conflicting visions of what would happen with white people.
Yeah, the Native Americans had, and some still have, a very different worldview than most white Americans. Their world was imbued with spirit. Every rock had spirit. Every tree had spirit. They all had at least one spirit guide, if not more. And it could be an animal. People use the phrase power animal. It could be a force of nature like wind or fog or lightning. And that spirit guide guided them and helped them and protected them and taught them sort of what to do. This was just how they lived. And their healers used spirit to heal people. I've already forgotten your question.
So have I. No, the prophecies and the
yeah, the
visions
prophecies.
What we tend to be very skeptical about.
They're medicine men who were spiritual leaders. Shamans is the word we would use today. Would have visions, and other people would have visions, and they would tell you that they learned things from the spirit world. And so they did have prophecies of different kinds of people coming, and people who could write and who could make all kinds of things, and then prophecies that those people would eventually drive them off the land and dam the rivers and kill off a lot of the salmon, because salmon were a big part of their life, hugely abundant source of food, and all kinds of other things that actually came true. They had these prophecies. And you know, they had traveled a long way. They got horses sometime in the 1700s, and they obviously went down to at least California, if not further, to get those from the Spaniards. And they say that they had traveled, one person before Lewis and Clark got there had traveled as far east as Cincinnati. So they were quite the travelers.
Right, right. And as I recall too, from not this book, but there was another people who had the vision of the horses coming, kind of thing. So
it was common. It was. The prophecies and visions were part of the native world. They were just part of the world. They happened, you know.
And they were attuned to it.
You know, if you read the New Testament, they were part of the early Christian world too. We've lost a lot of that. We've forgotten. But go read the New Testament.
And I have, and I sometimes often question whether some people who are professedly Christian have read it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we all do, don't we?
I guess we do. At any rate, so I guess it wasn't spirit guides exactly, but as you said, there was a whole lot of stuff you had to make up within the confines of the historical actual happenings. How do you create those kinds of things? What's the process of deciding that he's going to have this wife and she's going to die?
Well,
for example.
Let me say two things. One, I'm as much a historian as I am a novelist, so it's pretty close to history. And there's been a lot written about the Nez Perce because they were so much a favorite, and because their story is just so amazing and heartbreaking. There's been just a ton written about them, from anthropologists to novelists to historians. Lots of history books. Every couple of years a new history book comes out, usually about the war in 1877, but some of them about a broader range. So there's a lot of information out there, which was helpful. And there was a rancher in Washington State, near Yakima, Washington, in the 1920s, who hired migrant labor, and some of them were Indians, some of them were Nez Perce, and he befriended one of them named Yellow Wolf and wrote a book called Yellow Wolf, which was basically, he went with Yellow Wolf and his friends to all the battle sites from the war, and he told Yellow Wolf's story of the war. Then he wrote another book about the Nez Perce in general. So he had sources who were alive during the war. Those were very useful. There was another book written by a woman in another tribe in the Northwest, that it was another plateau tribe, the plateau between the Cascades and the Rockies, which had a lot in common with the Nez Perce. And she wrote two books around 1900, 1910. Her name was Morning Dove, I believe. And she wrote a book about sort of life there, which was very useful, and then she wrote a novel. So there was a lot of information. Then how do I make up characters and so on? You just it's a process of trial and error. It really is. You think about, okay, with Clark's wife or lover, there was a photo that grabbed me of an actual Nez Perce woman from the 1800s. And I used that, I had that up on my wall near my desk, and I used that as a sort of inspiration. And you just, you think, well, what would be interesting? Well, it'd be really interesting if she was kind of bold and really resisted Clark. You know, you don't want to. You want some tension in the relationship, right? And
so that people keep reading, as you said.
Yeah. So you make her into someone who's a chief's daughter, which she probably was. I mean, that's what the oral tradition says. Says she was a sister or daughter, but the way the years work out, I think daughter is much more likely. And so I made her quite bold, and then I decided, well, why would she resist him so much? Well, she's mourning. Her husband has died. Something I could relate to at the time, and write about knowledgeably. So and then you just kind of build, and as I said, there's so much trial and error. I probably wrote 15 drafts of this.
Oh, my goodness.
Not all of it, but if most of it, I just, and I probably threw out twice as much as is in the book. So you write, and some of it works and some of it doesn't, and you throw out what doesn't, and you try to make the stuff that works better, and you try to deepen the character, and you just keep doing that.
Because there are a lot of characters.
Yes, too many, probably.
What I found helpful too was that the glossary, so that, and especially where you refer to the Indian native names, and then the white names for them, and one, of course, that probably stands out, and anybody who knows, I think, a little bit about Native Americans history would be Chief Joseph.
He's the famous one.
He's the famous one.
Yeah, and his Nez Perce name was hard to translate. What it meant was a thunder being that rose out of Wallowa Lake and went to the mountaintop with a roar. How do you translate that? So most people have translated it as thunder traveling to distant mountains, something like that. And I used the word rising rather than traveling, because when I shorten it to thunder rising, it sounds better than thunder traveling, and they're both accurate. But yeah, it's hard. Translating their names was a challenge sometimes.
And pronunciation would be.
Yeah. Well, that's beyond me. I have a huge Nez Perce dictionary, but it's rather confounding.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It was in the epilogue, I think, that you mentioned that, why you translated things in a certain way.
Yeah.
And you did mention Washington State and Walla, but we haven't really pinpointed exactly where they were, and for people who are not familiar. As a New Englander, I'm not always familiar with
Yeah, their territory was in central Idaho, around Lewiston is the biggest city there, and down the Clearwater River and to the Salmon River, and along the Snake River, Hell's Canyon, which is on the Snake, and then the corner of Oregon and Washington. So if you kind of draw a circle around those areas, and there are maps in the book that show you that.
Right.
Yeah, and it's a phenomenal geographical area. The geology is incredible. Where Joseph and his band lived is one of the most beautiful valleys I've ever seen in my life. It's called the Wallowa Valley. And there's this beautiful green valley with these incredible mountains they're the Wallowa Mountains, but they're known as the Alps of Oregon because they look like the Alps. They're just gorgeous. And then a lot of the other bands which lived in Idaho lived in canyon country. Apparently long ago, there were, during the Ice Age, there were ice dams would build up in northwest Montana, and immense lakes would form, and then at some point the ice dam would break, and this more water than is in the Great Lakes would come coursing through the Northwest and cutting these canyons. That's what cut the Columbia Gorge, which goes right through the Cascade Range. So you're traveling along in Nez Perce country, and you're on a prairie, and it's a beautiful prairie, and you're accustomed to prairies ending with foothills and then mountains. And this one will end with a drop-off of about 2,000 feet into a river canyon.
Oh, wow.
Hell's Canyon on the Snake is the deepest canyon in North America.
Really?
It's deeper than the Grand Canyon.
Wow.
Now, it's not as dramatic because the Grand Canyon's walls are straight up and down, and Hell's Canyon's walls are not, they're kind of like that. But from top to bottom, it is the deepest. So it is amazing country.
Sounds like it.
Yeah.
And you traveled all that too?
I spent a lot of time out there, yep, and traveled it, went to see lots of sites. Most of the places I wrote about I've seen. Not every one, but most of them.
So that just adds to the realism of
Yeah.
this novel.
Every once in a while, Google Earth came in really handy.
And what did people do when they wrote before?
They couldn't Google all the
Yeah.
information they needed.
Exactly.
So, where can they get the book? And where can they get more information?
Well, you can, of course, get the book online at Amazon.com and at Barnes & Noble and other places that sell books online. And you can get it at some bookstores. And if your favorite local bookstore doesn't have it, you can ask them to order it. Bookstores are happy to order books for people. And you can suggest that they stock it. And they'll listen to those suggestions. So I don't know.
We can also tell our libraries if they don't have it.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it's, you know, in the Northeast, it's not a story that people know. It's not a
Right.
tribe that people know. In the Northwest, everybody knows about it. And I grew up in Northern California and had that experience at age 19 of traveling. So I've known about it for a long time, but people around here don't. So a lot of bookstores probably don't have it, but they will order it for you.
Well, I think there's a lot of wisdom in Native Americans, and I just want to read, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I need glasses to kind of finish off. And this is Chief Joseph, thunder rising to loftier mountain heights. Whenever the white man treats the Indian as they treat each other, then we shall have no more wars. We shall be all alike, brothers of one father and one mother, with one sky above us and one country around us, and one government for all. Then the great spirit chief who rules above will smile upon this land and send rain to wash out the bloody spots made by brothers' hands upon the face of the earth. For this time, the Indian race are waiting and praying.
Yeah, Joseph said that in Washington, D.C. After they were finally defeated in that war, after they had evaded and defeated 3 different armies, gone 1,500 miles, were caught 40 miles short of the Canadian border.
And unfortunately, we're going to have to end there. We're at the end of our
Okay.
But this has
Okay.
been wonderful. Thank you so much. And I hope you'll come back when you finish the other book, or when the other book comes out on reinventing American
Yeah.
schools.
I'd be happy to. Be
Fantastic.
happy to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.